Again, focusing on Chinook salmon, you're looking at this is an index of Chinook harvest. We call them index ports on Lake Huron. There's 10 ports along the Lake Huron coast that we sample every year. We creel them, angler catch, to see, kind of get a summary of what's going on in the lake. And busy graph, I understand, but the key points in this are that the average catch in these 10 ports prior to 2004 was right around 76,000 fish. After 2004, it's 3,100 fish. You know, you talk about change. This is change. This is huge change. This is lifetime, once in a lifetime change, where basically they were non-existent. Any fisheries for Chinook salmon that existed in Lake Huron after 2004 really was taking place to the north, and probably influence from Lake Michigan or North Channel there, where pockets of Alewife smelt still existed. So major response by the ecosystem, by the fisheries, to the changes that were occurring. So the resource obviously changed, right? The perfect storm had affected Lake Huron. And as one of the Great Lakes supporting major sport fisheries, there were a lot of people affected by what was going on in Lake Huron. And the graphs that I just showed you, of course, we share those with our constituents. We work with our constituents regularly to talk about this information. So, as an angler, looking at all of that information, especially those anglers that keyed in on Chinook salmon, the light at the end of the tunnel for them might have been the freight train. And if you were standing on the tracks and saw a freight train coming, what would you do?
Get off.
You'd get off, or you'd run the other way. And that's exactly what they did. You're looking at a trend line here of actual angler use. This is angler hours on Lake Huron from the late 80s through 2012. And we attribute the major drop in participation back in the late 80s, early 90s, probably to the decline in perch fisheries in Lake Huron. We don't have accurate enough information to say that that's exactly what it is, but we have a good idea, a good understanding that's why people left the fishery. But if you look from the period of 92 through really 2003, we had steady participation in Lake Huron, up around 2 million angler hours. But starting in 2004, from that point to present, we lost 50%. Went from 2 million angler hours to 1 million angler hours. That's a major change. And as I just mentioned, either you get off the tracks or you get hit by the train. I think they were thinking, my fishing's done. I mean, I got to go elsewhere. I got to do something different. It's not there. And so they went elsewhere or pursued different hobbies or different lake, possibly Lake Michigan, to pursue Chinook salmon fishing. So how do we look at the resource then as half full if what I just explained to you is going on and drastic changes and depending on your point of view as an angler, bad changes. I'm not going to stand up here before you and tell you that what's happened in Lake Huron is good. We've got invasive, exotic species that should not be in the Great Lakes, modifying the landscape, the entire ecosystem. That's not a good thing. But I am going to tell you that what is happening in Lake Huron now are positive changes that are really a response of the native species to the new environment. They are adapting, they are improvising, and very good things are happening. The exciting part of the good news is that it's native species. You're looking at here a trend line in recreational yield coming out of Lake Huron since 2000. And obviously the peak there, 2002, most of that's represented by Chinook salmon, lake trout, and yellow perch, with obviously the dark blue color at the bottom is Chinook salmon. After 2004, 87% of the yield coming out of Lake Huron is native species, driven by walleye, yellow perch, and lake trout. Yes, it's lower productivity. Yes, it's lower output, lower yield than it has been historically. But we've been impacted, major impacts to the ecosystem that have lowered the productivity of the lake. And actually there's some schools of thought that are actually likening Lake Huron now to the productivity levels of Lake Superior instead of Lake Michigan. So we have lower productivity, lower outputs, but the output is driven by native species. I'm going to run through a few of them, a few of the major sport fisheries and native species, and what their reaction has been, and what their ability to come back from this devastating change. So I'm sorry that you can't read the left margin. It's abundance of walleye over time, from basically the mid-90s all the way through present. This is change. This is obvious change. What's not on here is the stocking effort, stocking levels poured into Saginaw Bay and Lake Huron to try to recover walleye that were suppressed for decades. Millions of fish were being put in, but the ecosystem, for whatever reason, was not allowing walleye to recover. Something obviously happened in 2003, 2004, and that's this line. This is alewife. The dark blue line is overlaid showing alewife abundance, which crashed by 2004. In 1 year, 1 year after alewife crashed, walleye began a rise in abundance that we haven't even seen it before. We haven't measured it. And what followed from there, the yellow line, is the trend line for catch rate, angler catch rate, highest that we've recorded in 30 years. Major change, major difference from what it was prior, all based on alewife. And there's an interaction, an alewife-walleye interaction that I can't get into now, it would take too long, but basically alewife, even as a prey item, was serving as a predator on young walleye or walleye eggs or walleye fry, and not allowing this to happen until they were done. Another native species reacting to the change in the ecosystem is wild lake trout. Now, as manager on this lake, I can tell you that this, to me, is one of the most exciting things in my career. This lake trout recovery in the Great Lakes has been ongoing, and one of the foundations for the Great Lakes Fish Commission 60 years ago. Try to recover a native species that's been decimated over the decades. It's happening. We're in the process of it right now. It's going on. And a lot of it, again, can be tied back to alewife. Alewife carrying enzyme thiominase that doesn't allow a species like lake trout to actually absorb thiamine, vitamin B. So as alewife were being consumed by lake trout, the thiominase was preventing them basically from being successful in natural reproduction. Alewife crash, lake trout shift their diet, they take in thiamine, there's reproductive success. Now that's an oversimplification, but the point here is that that major change allowed lake trout to recover, but they had to change and shift their diet to most of the red gophers. So other site predators like bass and northern pike, numbers are up. While anglers aren't necessarily targeting them, the populations are up. I'm not going to say they're recovered because they weren't necessarily gone or suppressed, but they certainly are trending up. North Channel, St. Mary's, the Bays, Thunder Bay and Saginaw Bay, fantastic pike and bass fisheries. All of them increasing in abundance. I've already talked about walleye. We actually, one thing I did not mention on the graph that showed the walleye abundance, angler trends, and the alewife crash is they are actually considered recovered in Lake Huron and Saginaw Bay. We stopped stocking walleye in 2006, and we have not stocked since. That's a recovery story. So that species, it's hands off. Now we're monitoring. We're looking at regulation changes, possibly, but we're no longer intensively stocking that species. That leaves yellow perch, one of the dominant native species in Lake Huron. And I mentioned in the graph of angler use that we attribute a lot of that loss of angler use to the drop in yellow perch. Obviously, we recognize that. Obviously, we know that bringing yellow perch back to Lake Huron is a huge part of angler satisfaction, angler use, and we want to get there. There's some bottlenecks that are happening with yellow perch. I'm going to talk about those in a minute. But the point is that yellow perch are there and they're reproducing. They're just not creating that fishery that we once had, and we think it's due to a lot of the changes that have happened. One of the changes is this. This is just a snapshot. It's a pie chart showing the diet of walleye in 2001. The white colored portion of this pie chart is alewife. So back in 2001, alewife were really keying in on the abundant alewife that were moving in to the shore to spawn. They move in about May, which is about when out-migrating walleye adults are heading out of the bay. It was a perfect opportunity for them. This graph shows a much different picture. It's a time series from the late 80s through present, and I want you to look at a couple of things on here. The color blue, light blue, is gizzard shad. The green is alewife. So through the 80s and 90s, gizzard shad really was the focus for for walleye. They were keying in on gizzard shad. By the mid to late 90s, they had shifted. Gizzard shad had responded to the change in the environment, were declining. Alewife were abundant, and walleye changed. They shifted their diet. They changed over to alewife. All throughout the 2000s until 2004, when alewife crashed, and the yellow color is yellow perch. Walleye shifted almost entirely to yellow perch. I don't want to say entirely. A large part of their diet became yellow perch. So yellow perch went from a predator in Lake Huron to a prey item. And that change does not allow the recovery to happen because they're just not there in abundance as adults. They can't run the gauntlet. The last thing I want you to look at again is the tail end to the right of this graph, which is the light blue again. Gizzard shad are starting to show back up in large numbers and enter the diet again of walleye. Signs of recovery, positive signs, and maybe taking some of the pressure off yellow perch. We've embarked on a process to look at yellow perch management in Lake Huron, specifically Saginaw Bay, and this is some of the items that we're looking at right now. I've mentioned round gobies a lot, and I'm just going to put this up here real quickly because round gobies have become a major diet component, but we're having a difficult time sampling them, and the graph here is trying to show that in the late 90s, when their abundance really took off and we started seeing in the sampling here, we saw this peak, and we all thought, oh my gosh, they're going through the roof. But then the next couple of years, they were gone in our sampling here. Then they went back up. And really, it took us that time to understand it's not the goby population that's going up and down, it's our sampling inefficiencies. So that's really where our change is. Our change is going to be on trying to capture them. How do we do it? How do we set up sampling, design the protocol to do that? They are obviously contributing to diets. And I took out a couple of slides here. Brian, how much time do I have?
You got about
5-6 minutes, good. I took them out knowing I'd be running too long. But the goby component of whitefish diets is huge. It's off the charts. Some work done by GE and Jim Bentz has shown that whitefish have shifted from their traditional diets, which are no longer there. That's changed. Mysis to gobies. They become predators in the Lake Huron system, and actually a surrogate sampling method for us because we can't capture gobies, but they can. So managers, how does management respond to all that change? And obviously, Chinook salmon being the dominant predator at the time back in the mid-2000s, they responded to the change, the loss of wildlife. They crashed. They stopped returning to creel. And so we as managers made the decision, drastic decision, to stop stocking Chinook salmon in Lake Huron in all ports south of Rogers City. Now, I grew up in Michigan. I cut my teeth fishing on Lake Michigan for salmon. My dad got the salmon bug in about 72, and I spent my summers with him. And I can remember the frenzy of what that was like. Crowds of people, at access sites can't wait to get out there. All the way to today, or present times, and I'm helping to manage this fishery now, and I'm actually having anglers telling me that I need to stop stocking Chinook salmon as a manager. I mean, you talk about a change. That's a huge change. But obviously, what we were doing as an agency, raising and stocking fish, was not contributing to the fishery. They weren't returning. We had to make a decision and make adjustments, and we did. We do stock to the north, Nuns Creek, as an obligation to the consent decree. We stock Sheboygan River because there is a return to creel there, and the Swan because that's a backup facility, a broodstock facility for us on Lake Huron. Brown trout, another species that we stocked for decades. We tried over and over again. Brown trout was a species that keyed on smelt and alewife. Obviously, those are gone. So what happened to brown trout? They stopped returning to creel. We made a decision a few years ago to discontinue that program. One of the species that we have moved to and looked at differently is Atlantic salmon. And it's a species that for many years was raised entirely by Lake Superior State University and actually produced a very successful run in the St. Mary's. If you haven't been to the facility up at the Aquatic Research Lab, you should go. It's an interesting location. It's used as an educational facility. It's also used as a broodstock facility and stocking location for Atlantic salmon for Lake Huron. And it wasn't until recently that we, Fisheries Division, Department of Natural Resources, got back into Atlantic salmon rearing, hoping that Atlantics can fill a niche and that vacated by Chinook salmon, vacated by brown trout, that can produce a fishery that if it doesn't equal the returns from Lake Superior State, at least it can approximate those returns. We are finding that Atlantic salmon will return to creel at LSSU stock fish at about 4 to 6%, the highest return rate of any salmonids that we stock. We're shooting for a 2 to 3% return we'd like to see on our fish. And while we've had several years now of production level fish going out into Lake Huron, we're still not seeing the returns, and we think it has something to do with the size of stocking or potentially the condition of the receiving water. We're putting those fish out in April, late April, when the Great Lakes are pretty harsh. But this is an exciting program for us, and in addition to the natives that I was talking to you about, are hopefully on the horizon for a sport fishing opportunity in Lake Huron. Atlantic salmon are kind of a more generalist feeder. They don't necessarily key in on any one species, so we're hoping they can take advantage of the diversity of prey items in Lake Huron. So I'm going to leave you with those thoughts, and I'm going to leave you with this quote on change, because really progress is impossible without it. And anglers have to look at change and adapt to the change. The resource obviously has adjusted to the change, and we as managers are adjusting to the change. And if we don't, I guess anglers, if they don't change, they just decide to do something else. They go away. But as an agency, we can't. We have to continually look at what the resource is telling us, and then make decisions based on what that resource is telling us, and make good decisions, and then evaluate what's happening. And if our evaluation tells us we need to go in a different direction, it's our responsibility to communicate that to our constituents, and then make a different decision moving forward. That's all I've got.